This is the story of humanity's most desperate struggle, not against the roar of bolter fire or the clash of chainswords, but against an invisible death that drifts on every breeze. When the great devourer comes, it does not announce itself with grand proclamations or thunderous engines of war. Instead, it whispers its arrival through microscopic harbingers that fall like snow, each spore a promise of transformation, each breath a gamble with damnation itself. This is the chronicle of how ordinary men, women, and children face the Tyranid spore fall, and the terrible lengths to which they must go merely to draw another, uncontaminated breath. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, survival against the Tyranid bioplague is not measured in victories won or enemies slain, but in hours endured, and lungs kept clean. For when the hive fleets cast their biological shadow across a world, the true battle begins not in the trenches or the void, but in the very air that sustains life itself. The genesis of this horror lies in the fundamental nature of the Tyranid organism, a creature so thoroughly evolved for consumption that even its method of conquest serves as digestion. Long before the first termagant sets claw upon soil, long before the thunderous roar of carnifexes shakes the earth, the Tyranids have already begun their feast. The spores that rain down during the initial phases of planetary invasion are not merely weapons. They are the advanced digestive enzymes of a creature so vast that worlds themselves are but morsels to be broken down and absorbed. These biospores, known to imperial xenobiologists as Tyranniforma atmospherica, represent perhaps the most insidious aspect of the Tyranid threat. Unlike the crude biological weapons employed by lesser xenospecies, Tyranid spores are marvels of evolutionary engineering, microscopic organisms that carry within their protein shells the genetic templates for dozens of different bioforms. Each spore is simultaneously a seed, a virus, a bacterium, and a factory, capable of reading the atmospheric conditions, local flora, and even the genetic makeup of potential hosts to determine the most efficient form of biological warfare to deploy. When a hive fleet enters a system, the first phase of invasion begins millions of kilometers from the target world. Specialized bioships, their bellies swollen with billions upon billions of spores, position themselves in high orbit and begin the seeding process. The spores themselves are launched not through crude ballistics, but through a process of biological artillery that defies human understanding. Massive organic cannons, pulsing with bioluminescent veins, contract in rhythmic waves, propelling clouds of spores into the upper atmosphere with the precision of a master surgeon and the volume of a volcanic eruption. The spore clouds that result from this seeding can stretch across entire continents, appearing to orbital observers as a creeping brown-green stain that spreads across the planet's atmospheric envelope like some cosmic infection. To those on the ground, the first sign of spore fall often appears as nothing more than an unusual weather pattern. Clouds that seem too dense, too organic in their movement, carrying with them the faint scent of decay, and something indefinably alien. But the true horror of the spore fall lies not in its dramatic arrival, but in its insidious persistence. Unlike conventional atmospheric contaminants, Tyranid spores are living organisms, capable of adaptation, reproduction, and most terrifyingly, learning. They do not simply drift on the wind like pollen or ash. They actively navigate air currents, following chemical traces and electromagnetic signatures toward population centers. They can lie dormant in soil for months, waiting for the right conditions to activate. They can burrow through clothing, eat through basic filters, and even adapt to overcome specific countermeasures deployed against them. For the civilian populations caught in the path of such an invasion, the spore fall represents a fundamental transformation of their reality. The air itself becomes an enemy. Every breath becomes a calculated risk. The simple act of existing in an uncontrolled environment becomes a death sentence delivered in installments. This is the crucible in which ordinary citizens must forge their survival, and the methods they employ reveal both the resourcefulness of the human spirit and the terrible cost of existence in the 41st millennium. The first and most basic defense against spore contamination is environmental isolation. Those fortunate enough to live in properly equipped hive cities or military installations may find refuge in sealed atmospheric systems, but for the vast majority of imperial citizens, the farmers, the factory workers, the countless billions who toil in the open air, such luxury is a distant dream. Instead, they must rely on improvised solutions cobbled together from whatever materials their harsh lives have provided. The most common form of protection is the sealed hab unit, a desperate modification of existing dwellings that transforms homes into temporary survival bunkers. Windows are sealed with whatever materials can be found: plasteel sheeting for the fortunate, layers of clothing and scavenged metal for the desperate. Door frames are packed with rags, cloth, or in some cases, the rendered fat of livestock, anything that might create an airtight seal. Ventilation systems, where they exist, are blocked or fitted with improvised filtration systems. These improvised filters represent some of the most ingenious and horrifying adaptations developed by spore siege survivors. Layers of cloth soaked in industrial chemicals, screens of human hair woven together and treated with whatever antiseptic compounds can be obtained, even filters constructed from ground bone meal and ash, based on the folk wisdom that the remains of the dead might somehow protect the living from joining them. The effectiveness of such measures varies wildly, but in a situation where any protection is better than none, even the most desperate expedients are attempted. For those who must venture outside their sealed environments, personal protection becomes a matter of life and death, measured in minutes rather than hours. The fortunate few might possess military-grade rebreathers or industrial safety equipment, but most must make do with masks constructed from whatever materials they can obtain. Cloth soaked in alcohol or antiseptic solutions provides minimal protection. Leather masks with crystalline lenses scavenged from broken equipment offer slightly better defense. Some survivors resort to breathing through layers of their own clothing, changing the fabric frequently, and burning the contaminated material when possible. The most effective improvised protection comes from understanding the nature of the spores themselves. Tyranid bioorganisms, despite their alien origin, share certain vulnerabilities with terrestrial life forms. They are susceptible to extreme heat, certain chemical compounds, and specific forms of radiation. Survivors who have observed these weaknesses have developed correspondingly brutal countermeasures. Heat treatment of air is perhaps the most reliable method available to civilian populations. Survivors construct elaborate systems of pipes and chambers that force incoming air through flames or past heated metal surfaces. The temperature required to reliably kill Tyranid spores, approximately 400 degrees Celsius, means that such systems are energy-intensive and dangerous to operate. But for those with access to sufficient fuel, they provide reliable protection. The sight of these improvised furnaces, glowing red-hot in darkened buildings while their operators tend them with the devotion of tech priests maintaining sacred machinery, has become one of the defining images of spore siege survival. Chemical treatment offers another avenue of defense, though one fraught with its own dangers. Industrial chemicals, medical supplies, even certain types of alcohol can neutralize Tyranid spores under the right conditions. Survivors create fumigation chambers using sealed rooms filled with chemical vapors, or construct spray systems that mist potentially protective compounds into the air. The irony is not lost on those who employ such methods that in their desperation to avoid one form of death, they often expose themselves to another. Chemical burns, respiratory damage, and poisoning are common among those who rely too heavily on chemical protection. But in the calculus of spore siege survival, a quick death from chemical exposure is often preferable to the slow horror of spore infection. The most sophisticated civilian countermeasures emerge from communities that have had time to prepare and organize their defenses. These settlements, often guided by former military personnel or individuals with technical knowledge, develop comprehensive survival protocols that go far beyond simple environmental sealing. Water becomes as critical as air in these scenarios. Tyranid spores can contaminate water supplies with terrifying efficiency, transforming essential hydration into a vector for infection. Surviving communities establish elaborate water purification systems, boiling all water to temperatures that will kill any spores, then distilling it through improvised condensation systems to remove any remaining biological material. Some communities resort to drinking only alcohol, trusting that the chemical properties that preserve the drink will also protect them from contamination. Food presents an even greater challenge. Tyranid spores can infect crops, livestock, and even preserved foodstuffs with equal ease. Communities under spore siege often resort to eating only foods that have been processed at temperatures sufficient to kill any contamination. Charred meat, bread baked at extreme temperatures, vegetables boiled until they are barely recognizable as food. The nutritional deficiencies that result from such limited diets become their own form of crisis, as survivors must balance the immediate threat of spore infection against the slower death of malnutrition. The social dynamics of spore siege survival reveal the darker aspects of human nature under extreme stress. Communities that successfully defend against spore contamination become fortresses of the living, surrounded by zones of biological horror. The psychological pressure of maintaining perfect environmental discipline, never opening a door without proper decontamination procedures, never consuming unprocessed food, never breathing unfiltered air, creates a social structure rigid to the point of brutality. Contamination protocols in these communities are enforced with the desperation of the truly terrified. Individuals who show signs of spore infection, respiratory distress, skin discoloration, behavioral changes, are quarantined immediately, often permanently. Exile from the protected community becomes a common punishment for infractions of safety protocols, a sentence that is effectively a death warrant. Children who cry too loudly, elderly individuals who cannot maintain the physical demands of survival, anyone whose presence threatens the delicate balance of group survival may find themselves cast out into the contaminated wasteland beyond the settlement's defenses. The most successful surviving communities develop elaborate decontamination rituals for anyone entering their protected spaces. These procedures, born from desperate necessity rather than scientific understanding, often take on an almost religious significance. Individuals entering from the outside must strip completely, submitting to chemical washes that burn the skin and eyes, standing naked in fumigation chambers while toxic vapors swirl around them, submitting to physical inspections that would be humiliating under any other circumstances. The fact that these procedures often fail to prevent contamination entirely only serves to make them more elaborate, as communities convince themselves that more extreme measures will somehow provide the safety that moderate precautions could not. Personal hygiene becomes a matter of existential importance in ways that would seem absurd under normal circumstances. Survivors develop obsessive routines for cleaning themselves, their clothing, and their possessions. Hair is shaved off regularly to eliminate potential spore-harboring surfaces. Fingernails are kept trimmed to the quick. Clothing is changed frequently and burned after use, forcing many survivors to resort to wearing improvised garments constructed from whatever materials they can repeatedly sterilize. The psychological toll of such existence cannot be overstated. Survivors report a constant state of hypervigilance, an exhausting mental condition where every sensation, every itch, every unusual taste, every moment of fatigue is analyzed for signs of contamination. Sleep becomes difficult as individuals wake repeatedly to check their breathing, to examine their skin for discoloration, to verify that their sealed environment remains intact. Many survivors develop compulsive behaviors around safety protocols, checking and rechecking seals, filters, and decontamination procedures with a frequency that borders on the pathological. The isolation enforced by spore siege conditions amplifies these psychological pressures. Contact with other humans outside of one's immediate survival group becomes impossible, as any meeting carries the risk of contamination. Communication with the outside world ceases entirely, leaving survivors with no knowledge of how the larger invasion is progressing or whether relief might eventually come. This isolation breeds paranoia, conspiracy theories, and eventually, in many cases, complete mental breakdown. Children present particular challenges in spore siege survival scenarios. Their smaller body mass makes them more vulnerable to spore infection, while their natural curiosity and energy make it difficult to maintain the constant vigilance required for survival. Many adult survivors report that caring for children under these conditions becomes a source of constant terror, as every cough, every complaint of discomfort, every moment of childhood rebellion becomes a potential sign of contamination or a threat to group security. Families are forced to make decisions that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. Children who become ill, whether from spore infection or simple childhood diseases that would normally be easily treatable, may be abandoned or even killed by their own parents to prevent the spread of contamination. The psychological trauma of such decisions creates wounds that never heal, even among those who ultimately survive the crisis. The elderly face their own unique challenges in spore siege survival. Their weakened immune systems make them particularly vulnerable to spore infection, while their reduced physical capabilities may make it difficult for them to maintain the constant activity required for survival tasks. Many elderly survivors report being treated as burdens by their communities, tolerated only as long as they can contribute to survival efforts. The moment they become unable to work or require additional resources for medical care, they often find themselves facing exile, or worse. Religious and philosophical adaptations emerge as survivors struggle to make sense of their situation. Some communities interpret the spore fall as a divine punishment, developing elaborate theological explanations for why the emperor has allowed such suffering to befall his faithful. These religious frameworks often provide psychological comfort, but they can also lead to destructive behaviors such as ritual self-punishment, the persecution of supposed heretics within the community, or fatalistic acceptance of doom that undermines practical survival efforts. Other communities develop quasi-scientific belief systems around spore behavior, creating elaborate theories about spore vulnerability that have little basis in fact, but provide the illusion of understanding and control. These folk sciences often involve ritualistic behaviors, specific prayers to be recited while tending filtration systems, particular arrangements of protective symbols, elaborate timing requirements for various survival activities that serve no practical purpose but provide psychological comfort to those who practice them. The economic structures of normal imperial life collapse entirely under spore siege conditions. Money becomes meaningless when there is nothing safe to buy and nowhere safe to go. Instead, communities develop barter systems based on survival necessities: clean water, uncontaminated food, fuel for heating systems, materials for maintaining environmental seals. The most valuable commodities become those that directly support survival: functioning rebreathers, chemical supplies for decontamination, sealed containers for food storage. Labor is reorganized around survival necessities rather than productive economic activity. The most important jobs become those that maintain the community's defenses against contamination: tending filtration systems, monitoring environmental seals, processing food and water to ensure safety, maintaining heat sources for sterilization. Traditional craftsmen may find their skills useless, while individuals with knowledge of chemistry, engineering, or medicine become invaluable community resources. Trade between communities becomes virtually impossible due to contamination risks, leading to severe shortages of specialized materials and knowledge. Communities that lack individuals with technical expertise often develop wildly incorrect theories about spore behavior, leading to ineffective or even counterproductive survival strategies. The isolation imposed by spore siege conditions means that hard-won knowledge about effective countermeasures cannot be shared between communities, forcing each group to rediscover successful techniques through their own experimentation or to fail for lack of critical information. The physical environment itself becomes an active enemy in ways that extend far beyond simple contamination. Tyranid spores do not merely threaten human health, they actively reshape the ecosystem around them. Plant life infected with spores undergoes rapid genetic modification, transforming familiar vegetation into alien forms that serve Tyranid purposes. Trees may begin producing toxic saps, or developing thorn-like growths that can inject spores directly into the bloodstream of any creature that touches them. Grasses might develop root systems that extend unnaturally deep, creating underground networks that can rapidly spread contamination across wide areas. Animal life suffers even more dramatic transformations. Livestock infected with Tyranid spores begin showing behavioral changes within hours of exposure, becoming aggressive, displaying unnatural intelligence, and eventually developing physical mutations that serve Tyranid purposes. Infected animals may develop enhanced sensory capabilities that allow them to hunt uninfected humans with supernatural efficiency, or they might develop specialized organs that allow them to spread spores more effectively. Most terrifyingly, these infected creatures retain enough of their original appearance to potentially deceive desperate survivors. A cow that appears normal from a distance might reveal, upon closer inspection, additional limbs, sensory organs that glow with bioluminescent light, or behavioral patterns that serve to herd other animals, including humans, toward areas of higher spore concentration. Survivors quickly learn to trust no animal life outside of their secured areas, leading to the systematic slaughter of any creatures that approach their settlements. The transformation of the physical environment creates navigational challenges that compound the difficulties of survival. Familiar landmarks disappear as infected vegetation grows at unnatural rates, creating dense, hostile forests where none existed before. Roads become impassable as infected plant growth breaks through paving materials and creates barriers designed to channel traffic toward areas of maximum contamination. Even the topography itself may change as infected root systems undermine foundations, and infected organisms create new structures that serve alien purposes. Weather patterns become unpredictable and often hostile as atmospheric contamination reaches critical levels. Spore-heavy air creates its own form of precipitation, with contaminated moisture falling as rain, snow, or fog that carries even higher concentrations of infectious organisms. Survivors learn to recognize the subtle signs that indicate contaminated weather: the wrong color in cloud formations, unusual wind patterns that seem to follow biological rather than meteorological logic, precipitation that has an oily consistency or carries the distinctive scent of Tyranid bioorganisms. The most successful long-term survival strategies involve complete abandonment of surface-level existence. Communities that survive extended spore siege conditions often retreat underground, excavating bunker systems that provide complete isolation from the contaminated surface environment. These underground facilities require sophisticated engineering to maintain air quality, waste disposal, and food production without any contact with the surface world. Underground survival presents its own unique challenges. Excavation must be done carefully to avoid breaking into groundwater systems that may already be contaminated. Ventilation systems require multiple layers of filtration and air processing that consume enormous amounts of energy. Food production in underground environments requires artificial lighting systems and hydroponic growing methods that most civilian populations lack the expertise to implement effectively. Waste disposal becomes a critical engineering challenge in underground survival scenarios. Human waste, contaminated materials, and the bodies of those who succumb to infection must all be disposed of in ways that prevent contamination of the sealed environment. Many underground communities develop elaborate incineration systems that burn waste at temperatures sufficient to destroy any biological contamination, while others resort to sealed storage systems that essentially create toxic waste dumps within their own living spaces. The social dynamics of underground survival often become even more rigid and oppressive than surface communities. The complete dependence on artificial life support systems means that any individual who threatens the community's technical infrastructure, whether through accident, sabotage, or simple incompetence, represents an existential threat to everyone. This leads to authoritarian social structures, where technical experts wield absolute power and dissent of any kind is treated as a form of treason. Mental health deteriorates rapidly in underground environments, where natural light is completely absent and the walls themselves seem to press in with the weight of the contaminated world above. Many survivors develop claustrophobic disorders, depression related to light deprivation, and paranoid delusions about the integrity of their protective systems. Suicide rates in underground survival communities often exceed death rates from spore contamination, as individuals choose quick death over the psychological torture of indefinite subterranean existence. Medical care under spore siege conditions requires complete revision of normal healthcare practices. Any medical procedure that involves breaking the skin creates a potential vector for spore infection, making even minor injuries potentially fatal. Surgery becomes virtually impossible unless performed in completely sterile environments that most civilian communities cannot maintain. Medications may become contaminated. Medical instruments may harbor spores despite cleaning efforts. And even medical personnel become potential carriers of contamination. The symptoms of spore infection often mimic those of common illnesses, making early diagnosis difficult and leading to tragic mistakes in patient isolation. A simple cough might indicate respiratory infection from contaminated air, or it might be a normal response to the harsh chemical fumes used for decontamination. Skin discoloration could be a sign of spore-induced genetic modification, or it might result from chemical burns inflicted during decontamination procedures. The paranoia surrounding potential infection means that individuals showing any unusual symptoms are often quarantined or exiled before proper diagnosis can be made. Pain management becomes particularly challenging when pharmaceutical supplies become contaminated or exhausted. Many survivors resort to alcohol as a general anesthetic for necessary medical procedures, while others develop folk remedies based on locally available plants that may or may not provide actual medical benefit. The lack of proper medical care means that minor injuries often become major medical emergencies, and major injuries almost invariably result in death. Reproductive health faces catastrophic disruption under spore siege conditions. Pregnancy becomes a terrifying prospect as spores can cross placental barriers and infect developing fetuses, leading to births of creatures that appear human but carry Tyranid genetic modifications. Many communities ban sexual activity entirely as a contamination control measure, while others require elaborate protection protocols that make intimate human contact virtually impossible. Childbirth, when it occurs, must be performed under conditions of absolute sterility that are nearly impossible to maintain in civilian survival situations. Infant mortality rates approach 100% in many spore siege communities, not only from direct spore infection, but from the inability to provide proper medical care under survival conditions. The psychological trauma of losing children to infection creates its own cascade of mental health crises that can destabilize entire communities. The elderly and chronically ill become impossible burdens under spore siege conditions. Their medical needs cannot be met without compromising the safety of the entire community, while their reduced immune systems make them particularly vulnerable to spore infection. Many communities develop explicit policies regarding the treatment of such individuals, ranging from quarantine in separate areas to outright euthanasia. The moral weight of such decisions adds another layer of psychological trauma to an already unbearable situation. Communication and coordination between survival communities becomes essential for long-term success, but nearly impossible to achieve safely. Radio transmissions may be monitored or disrupted by Tyranid bioorganisms that have evolved electronic warfare capabilities. Physical messengers face almost certain death when traveling through contaminated areas. Even when communication is possible, the information shared may be incorrect, outdated, or deliberately misleading as communities compete for scarce resources. Some communities develop elaborate signaling systems using lights, smoke, or other visual indicators that can be observed from a distance without requiring direct contact. These systems allow basic information exchange, warnings about spore concentrations, indications of community status, requests for specific resources, but they cannot support the detailed coordination required for complex survival strategies. The most sophisticated communication systems involve relay networks, where messages are passed between communities through intermediary stations, allowing information to travel long distances without requiring any individual to traverse contaminated areas. These networks require elaborate protocols to prevent the transmission of contaminated materials along with information, and they often break down when key relay stations are compromised by spore infiltration. Resource management under spore siege conditions requires constant balancing of immediate needs against long-term survival prospects. Every material that enters the protected environment must be decontaminated, a process that often damages or destroys the very resources needed for survival. Food must be processed at temperatures that reduce its nutritional value. Clothing must be treated with chemicals that weaken the fabric. Tools and equipment must be subjected to cleaning procedures that may impair their functionality. Energy becomes the most critical resource as all survival activities, air filtration, water purification, food processing, decontamination procedures, require enormous amounts of power. Communities that lack access to reliable energy sources often face the terrible choice between maintaining their protective systems and conserving fuel for long-term survival. Many communities ultimately fail not because their defenses are breached, but because they exhaust their energy resources and can no longer maintain the systems that keep them alive. Fuel for heating and power generation becomes increasingly difficult to obtain as surface-based fuel sources become contaminated and transportation networks collapse. Communities may resort to burning anything that will produce heat: furniture, books, clothing, even the wooden structures of their own buildings, to maintain the temperatures required for sterilization procedures. The desperate search for burnable materials often forces survivors to venture into contaminated areas, creating a deadly cycle where the need for fuel forces exposure to the very contamination they are trying to avoid. Maintenance of critical systems becomes a constant struggle as spare parts become impossible to obtain and improvised repairs begin to accumulate. Air filtration systems that were designed for temporary use must be maintained for months or years without proper replacement components. Sealing materials deteriorate under constant chemical exposure and extreme temperature cycling. Electronic systems fail due to lack of proper maintenance and cannot be repaired without components that are no longer available. The technical expertise required to maintain complex survival systems often exceeds the knowledge available within civilian communities. Engineers, chemists, and medical professionals become invaluable community assets, but their specialized knowledge cannot easily be transferred to others. When these technical experts become ill, are injured, or die from spore infection, entire communities may lose the capability to maintain their survival systems. Quality control for survival procedures becomes a matter of life and death, but the stress and resource limitations of spore siege conditions make maintaining standards extremely difficult. Filtration systems may develop undetected leaks. Decontamination procedures may become less effective as supplies are diluted to make them last longer. Food processing protocols may be shortened to conserve fuel, reducing their effectiveness against spore contamination. The cumulative effect of these small compromises in safety procedures is often catastrophic community failure. A minor leak in an air filtration system may allow enough spore infiltration to begin the infection process. A slight reduction in decontamination effectiveness may permit contaminated materials to enter the protected environment. A shortcut in food processing may introduce infected nutrition into the community's food supply. Time itself becomes a weapon in the Tyranid arsenal as the duration of spore siege conditions exceeds the planning capacity of most civilian communities. Survival strategies that work for days or weeks may prove unsustainable over months or years. Resource stockpiles that seem adequate for short-term survival become insufficient for extended siege conditions. The psychological resilience that allows communities to maintain discipline and cooperation under extreme stress gradually erodes as the crisis extends indefinitely. Many communities experience complete social breakdown, not from external threats, but from the accumulated stress of maintaining impossible survival standards for extended periods. Individuals who have successfully followed elaborate safety protocols for months may suddenly abandon all precautions in moments of exhaustion or despair. Community leaders who have made life and death decisions daily may suffer complete mental collapse when the weight of their responsibilities becomes unbearable. The question of when to abandon survival efforts and accept death becomes a constant philosophical and practical consideration for spore siege survivors. The quality of life in a perfectly sealed survival environment is often so degraded that existence becomes a form of torture. The constant fear, the social oppression, the physical discomfort, and the psychological isolation may make death seem preferable to continued survival. Some communities develop elaborate protocols for group suicide when their situation becomes completely hopeless. Others designate certain individuals to make the decision about when continuation of survival efforts is no longer worthwhile. The moral weight of such decisions creates additional psychological trauma for survivors who must choose not only when to die, but when to allow others to die, and when to force others to continue living in intolerable conditions. Yet, despite the overwhelming horror of spore siege survival, human ingenuity and determination continue to find ways to endure. The most successful survival stories emerge from communities that develop sustainable closed-loop systems, creating artificial ecosystems that can maintain themselves indefinitely without contact with the contaminated outside world. These communities often evolve their own unique cultures, developing new social norms, religious practices, and technological innovations that are specifically adapted to their survival environment. The children who grow up in such communities represent perhaps the most profound adaptation to spore siege conditions. Having never experienced normal human society, they accept the elaborate safety protocols and social restrictions as natural aspects of existence. They develop enhanced sensitivity to chemical traces that might indicate contamination, learn to operate complex filtration and decontamination systems as easily as children in normal society learn to read and write, and display psychological resilience to conditions that would drive normal adults to madness. These adapted communities sometimes develop technologies that exceed the capabilities available to normal imperial society. Their desperate need for efficiency in every aspect of survival drives innovation in areas such as closed-loop life support, waste recycling, hydroponics, and environmental monitoring. The techniques they develop out of necessity might, under different circumstances, provide advances in technology that could benefit the wider Imperium. But perhaps the most significant adaptation is psychological rather than technological. Successful long-term survivors develop a form of mental discipline that allows them to maintain hope and purpose even in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. They learn to find meaning in the simple act of survival itself, to take satisfaction in successfully completing another day of elaborate safety protocols, to maintain human dignity even when living conditions would seem to preclude any form of dignity. The communities that survive spore siege conditions often develop their own unique forms of art, music, and literature that reflect their extraordinary circumstances. Songs that incorporate the rhythms of air filtration systems, stories that celebrate the heroes who maintain environmental seals, artwork created from the limited materials available in sealed environments. These cultural productions serve not only as entertainment but as psychological anchors that maintain connection to human identity even under the most dehumanizing conditions. The knowledge accumulated by spore siege survivors represents one of the most valuable resources available to the Imperium in its struggle against the Tyranid threat. The practical techniques they develop, the hard-won understanding of spore behavior they acquire, and the social adaptations they create could potentially save millions of lives in future invasions. However, the isolation imposed by spore siege conditions means that this knowledge often dies with the communities that develop it, lost forever when the last survivors finally succumb to infection or exhaustion. When relief finally comes, whether through successful Imperial military intervention or through the natural conclusion of the Tyranid feeding cycle, the survivors who emerge from spore siege conditions are fundamentally changed by their experience. They carry with them not only the technical knowledge of survival techniques, but also the psychological scars of extended existence under impossible conditions. Many are unable to readjust to normal human society, having become so adapted to survival conditions that they cannot function without the constant threat and elaborate safety protocols that defined their existence during the siege. The broader implications of civilian spore siege survival extend far beyond the immediate military situation of any particular Tyranid invasion. The techniques developed by desperate civilians often provide insights that benefit Imperial military forces, while the social adaptations they create offer models for other communities facing similar threats. Most importantly, the simple fact that humans can survive such conditions provides hope that the species itself may endure even the most thorough Tyranid assault. In the final analysis, the story of how civilians survived Tyranid spores is not merely a tale of technical innovation and desperate improvisation. It is a testament to the fundamental resilience of the human spirit, to the extraordinary lengths that ordinary people will go to preserve not just their lives, but their humanity itself. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, where hope is a rare commodity and survival often comes at the cost of everything that makes life worth living, these forgotten heroes, the housewives who tend makeshift filtration systems, the children who learn to test air quality before taking a breath, the elderly who choose exile rather than burden their communities, represent the true strength of the Imperium. They may never fire a laser gun in anger or pilot a mighty war machine against the alien threat. Their names will never be inscribed in the annals of Imperial glory or remembered in the prayers of the faithful, but in their quiet determination to draw one more clean breath, to protect one more child from contamination, to maintain one more day the fragile bubble of human life in an ocean of alien horror. They embody the essential truth that has allowed humanity to endure for 40,000 years, that survival itself, when achieved against impossible odds and maintained at terrible cost, is a form of victory that no alien force can ultimately defeat. The air they fight to keep clean, the children they struggle to protect, the communities they sacrifice to preserve, these are not mere tactical objectives in a larger war, but the very essence of what makes humanity worth defending. In learning how to survive the spore fall of the Great Devourer, they remind us that even in the face of extinction itself, the human capacity for adaptation, cooperation, and hope remains the species' greatest weapon against the darkness that surrounds us. When the spores finally settle and the last filtration system falls silent, when the sealed doors are opened for the final time and the survivors emerge to face whatever world remains, they carry with them the most precious cargo of all, the knowledge that humanity endures not because it is strong, but because it refuses to surrender even when strength has failed. In this refusal, in this stubborn insistence on continued existence against all logic and hope, lies the true secret of how civilians survive Tyranid spores, not through superior technology or military might, but through the simple, profound determination to remain human until the very end.